So here is an example of how this input box function looks like. So you have this dialog box which has a prompt, basically the text um, in the input box. Here is the enter the number of hours worked. There's a title right at the top at the title bar, and there's also an input area where the user can enter something. So, and the syntax for the input box function is given after input box within parentheses prompt, then title, then a default response. Basically, if the user it's a pre-filled value for the user to input. So it can be a 0 or a certain number, or it can be just an empty string. So and I mean, some examples are given of how to actually write instructions with input box. So if you have if you assign it to a certain variable, then whatever the user enters in the input area will be assigned to that variable. So for the example one, if the input box basically asks the user to enter their first name, and once they actually enter it there, that value or that string is input into the first name. So and that's the only argument inside that input box function. So by default it's just like shows a certain default title and a default response, which is generally 0 in most cases. So, and in the next example, there's the prompt, and also the title is also shown. So the prompt is city name and the title is city. And if the if the user inputs a certain city name, that is stored in the variable called city. Now let me talk about a certain application which uses input boxes, counters, accumulators, loops, and all that fun stuff. This is pretty similar to the application given in the textbook, and I mean it basically does most of the same things that it's given there. Now this application basically is a sales application. It displays the average amount the company sold during the last year. As an input, it requires amount of each salesperson's sales, and then it basically adds them up and divides by the number of persons to get the average value. Now the pseudocode is given at the bottom of this slide. Here there's something called a priming read. So it basically is used to obtain the first input from the user, and this priming read is generally like a input box function. And after the priming read, then after some condition, some loops are executed. So part of this application is also to make sure that the variable which is returned is not a 0, because it's used as a divisor. So if you divide something by 0, you get infinity. So if the user does not input any amount, then just a 0 is basically used. But before that, let's go through in more detail through the pseudocode. So what it does is first it pops up an input box, and it asks for a sales amount from the user, assuming that the user is a salesperson. And then once that happens, it repeats this process if the user actually enters a sales amount. So if the user enters a sales amount, there's a counter, and the counter increments. The sales amount is added to a certain accumulator variable which stores the total sales, and then it repeats the process again and again once every user enters some non-zero value for sales. Once some user does not enter any value, non-zero value like an actual sales number, then the loop stops. And you go to step 3, where the counter variable contains a value that is greater than 0. So basically, if you have more than if you actually have any salesperson entering any value, then this if statement is actually executed. If nobody entered any value, like the first user did not enter any value, the loop does not run. So in that case, I mean, the if statement is cancelled and it goes to the else statement, where you just display 0 in the average value. But if actually some salesperson did enter some value, then the average amount is calculated by looking at the accumulator variable divided by the counter variable. So the counter variable gives you the number of salesperson, the accumulator variable gives you the total sales, and then just display the average sales amount in some label. Here is the actual code for doing all this, and so you see that we defined a bunch of variables like prompts, titles. So the prompt is enter sales amount, click cancel to end. Title is sales entry, and these are all for the input boxes. Other than that, we have input sales, sales counter, accumulator average, and all that fun stuff. So here the priming read is the input box command, input sales equals to input box, comma prompt, comma title, comma double quote 0. So the prompt, the title is entered and the default response is 0. And assuming the input sales is not an empty string, meaning that the user did not just cancel or close the input box, then execute the do while loop, and that basically redoes this instruction until some user just hits cancel. So for this loop to run, the user has to input a non-zero value, hit OK, and then again it will continue to run. So, and then once the loop starts running, you parse the text or the number entered by the user, and you basically assign that to the value sales, to the variable sales, and in each loop you increment the counter by 1. In each loop you increment the accumulator with the new sales value entered, so that you get the total sales value. And at the end, just before the end of the loop, you see another instruction for an input box. So this pops up the next input box where the next user will enter their input. So once somebody hits a cancel, then it goes to the if statement. So if sales counter is greater than 0, meaning that actually some person did register some sales, then sales average is calculated, then that is displayed in the C2 or the currency format. If nobody entered any values, then average label dot text or the text for the label just gives you $0. So that's basically the code for writing down this application, and it uses all those things which you have learned, right? The do while statement, input boxes, counters, and accumulators.